Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Scott Bridgen. Scott is a global lead of GRC and Integrated Risk at OneTrust, which is the fastest growing software company according to Inc. 500 magazine. Scott, thank you for coming to our interview today again.
Thank you, and lovely to be here.
Absolutely, my pleasure. We had our first interview a few months back in which we talked about the quick growth of your company, OneTrust, and what are major drivers behind it. We also discussed challenges and misconception around GRC and ERM. And in today's interview, I would like to concentrate more on trust and how to measure trust, because it's in the name of your company. And because unfortunately, trust is a kind of perception, and it is often a hidden variable. It is difficult to understand, measure, and improve. And for many of us, trust kind of escapes a simple measurement because its meaning is too subjective for universally reliable metrics. So what is your definition of trust, Scott?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because trust seems to be an arbitrary concept. We all know as human beings what trust means. We, know whether or not we trust someone or something from that perspective. And all too often, we will share our thoughts on whether or not we trust X. However, when we talk about organizations, businesses often, I would say that trust is at an all-time low. So, and the reason for that is a number of things. The pandemic certainly didn't help. But prior to that, there had been, I think, a sort of an ongoing shift between socioeconomic, political, environmental, and just the world, because we have so much information available to us. It's disseminating whether or not we trust that information. And if you go on any social media, pretty much anything, LinkedIn is quite interesting these days because I see it bleed more into LinkedIn. But anything from TikTok through to Instagram, do you really trust what you're seeing? And you see a lot of people who don't from that perspective. So organizations want to be more trusted. The Edelman report, they have talked about sort of trust in lots of different ways. And obviously they measure it in a very traditional sort of, are you more trusted? Do people trust, organizations and the CEOs and that kind of stuff? However, from a OneTrust perspective, we're a technology house, right? We're a software house, and we want to help organizations be more trusted. So we look at the outcome and we have to break it down so we can translate it so an organization can actually understand it and say, well, actually, this is how OneTrust can help us become more trusted. So the definition is trust is an earned outcome, is an exchange. And the way that that works from an organization's perspective is it's a collection of integrity-based commitments and actions that are continuously measured, tested, and enforced through consistent behavior. The beauty of breaking it down in such a way, and I think it's a really lovely, simple way to do so, is you can take each of those steps and you can utilize technology to evidence and begin to measure aspects of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in layman terms, for example, if I am a potential customer and I'm looking for a company, and I kind of trust is one of the kind of most important things that I will use to choose a company. What on my mind are important? Of course, how people talk about company, maybe how people have feedback on other customers, but what is the aura of trust how companies should come to this aura of generating trust?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So there are dividends of trust, which can be utilized. And whether that's, as you rightly mentioned, there is an aura, or whether there are specific actions or evidences that an organization can provide. it varies depending on the type of organization, business to business, business to consumer, the type of industry that you're in, the region, the localization, the global reach of an organization, and also the type of work that a business does. There are some industries that if you were to ask someone in the street, regardless of whether or not an organization has, done anything bad or whatever it may be, there's still a mistrust, because of the way the media has portrayed certain industries. So there's always going to be preconceived ideas that you're fighting against. And I don't think any measurement, any evidence is ever going to, unfortunately, be able to combat that. But the general dividends are the fact that once you understand how you can measure elements of trust that can contribute towards being more trusted, because there isn't like a magic wand, unfortunately, where you say, right, measure these 5 things, and if you do these 5 things, and you can come up with a lovely Gaussian calculation at the end of it, and suddenly you are more trusted. It just doesn't work that way. But what you can get from it is 2 things, and 2 are probably the most important things. The first one is the culture piece. Within an organization, culture is key. Culture is one of those aspects that I find I find it super interesting for a number of reasons. This reaches a certain size of an organization where that tone from the top culture that everyone says that we must have, which is absolutely fundamental, stops being culture. It becomes actually governance, because an organization's size and scale and sprawl is particularly sort of difficult. And what actually happens at that point is you get tribal pockets of culture. And that's where problems begin to occur, because peers, and this isn't just, Scott Bridgen coming up with some kind of idea. There's lots of, obviously, there's a great book called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by a chap called Julian Jaynes. And he touches on aspects of this in different ways. And one of the things that I find most fascinating is this tribal nature of culture. And this is where trust and distrust becomes quite critical. However, if you have the ability in the land of GRC, right, as risk professionals, often called risk managers, but we are not risk managers. We are the custodians of risk. I wish the industry would change the job titles. And that, do you know what I mean? Because it would make life much easier for everyone when they are trying to build these cultures of trust. The culture of trust, though, and the culture of doing all of this stuff doesn't just come from trying to teach and train. I think the place that we find ourselves now and the type of workforce that we have, we've just got to bake it into day to day. All of this risk and compliance activities needs to become part of the fabric and culture. And this is the key, because if you bake it into the day to day and don't just make it a specific one-time or periodic thing like control reviews or risk reviews or that side of things, if it just becomes culturally as part of the day-to-day organization, then that tribalistic piece is much easier not to control, but to ensure that it embeds and remains. And that is, from an aura perspective, one of the best ways of being able to build it up internally. And there's lots of organizations that do this. There'll probably be a lot of people sat here listening or watching this going, well, that's what we do, but there's lots of people that don't do it. There are lots of other dividends of trust, but we can touch on those during the course of this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but let's, for example, when we take one segment of, because we now have, we heard about a lot about decentralized finance, right? This is all kind of peer-to-peer networks that loan money. And this is all generated because of a lack of trust with current centralized finance, with the people don't trust even Bitcoin. They just develop Bitcoin because they don't trust all this financial system with money and inflating the situation. So is it, of course, it's bigger than one company, but it's still trust as a kind of glue of all business solutions that probably pop up in the coming period. So do you have some opinion on what is going on with all these different segments of business generating from lack of trust in the current system?
Yeah, so that's, and you raise a really interesting point. The monetary level, so the trust in the sort of, all of the monetary and financial systems is actually age old. I mean, I'm sure people sat listening will have heard anecdotes of friends or relatives or people they've read about hiding money under the mattress because they didn't trust banks. And now in the modern day, you have kind of 2 or 3 schools of different levels of trust. You have those that trust the system or just go with it because it's commonly accepted, and they're like, well, look, there are certain aspects that could fail from that standpoint, but you know what, it's my risk appetite or whatever, I'll just go with it, or it's just too difficult to worry about because people have got bigger things to care. Then you've got the sort of the ones that don't trust the likes of cryptocurrency and as you rightly mentioned, sort of digital currencies from that perspective. And that's because I don't think they're a currency yet. They're an investment. People, I have been long involved. I just did it back in the day when you used to use your computer to mine bitcoins and things like that. And I never saw it as a currency. Like, it wasn't something that I would just go and pay with. What it was the accumulate, and then you would see it as a medium to long-term kind of investment. Cryptocurrency is a bit weird at the moment because it is more investment based. And if you go onto any of the Reddit or other site forums where people extensively talk about this, it is referred to as an investment rather than a currency. And that is where I think a lot of people don't trust it, because when it's an investment, we all know investments go up and down, whereas traditional currency, whilst the value of our dollar, pound, euro, or whatever it may be, does go up and down, the day-to-day side of things, we don't see the impact of that until it hits the high street or the petrol pumps or whatever it may be. And that's not always directly related to that money. It's normally tax and inflation and other things and the cost of other bits and pieces. So it's an interesting one from that perspective. But to answer your question about the trust in those aspects, I would say that lots of people are generally cynical. And I think that level of cynicism is fair, because the financial markets, whether it's standardized currency, whether it's investments, whether it's cryptocurrency, everything feels very much out of our hands. And I don't think there's really anything anyone can do to it's an interesting one, actually. If there was someone running all of this just as one piece and they were like the CEO of currencies, I don't think there's any activity or action that they could take. There's nothing that they could do to make themselves more trusted. I think it's one of those situations where that obviously is down to the individual.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's make a finalizing thought. How does someone listening to this take action with regards to your idea to implement what is your kind of meaning of trust and its application to business life?
Yeah, so this is where it gets interesting, because there are practical steps that organizations can do across different risk and compliance domains. Now, having a trust score, unfortunately, there's been talks about this for a long time, and no one has really come up with a particularly solid concept that encompasses everything, because it's almost impossible. And as you rightly mentioned at the beginning of this, there are certain aspects of it that are immeasurable. There aren't metrics that we could associate with it. But there are things that we can do that can contribute. And that contribution to the other actions and activities the organization takes can improve the perception and also the evidence of being a more trusted company. So if we look at it from a risk and compliance perspective, because trust is an earned outcome, and at the absolute heart of the definition, that collection of integrity-based commitments, well, those could be the actions that we're taking in relation to the certain key and critical risks that we have within our organization, or the endeavors that we're taking to ensure compliance in certain areas, or improvements from findings that the internal audit team have taken. So what you can do is you can start to actually take some of the key and core and critical activities. So it's about prioritization. In the same way that organizations prioritize risk based on the ability to impact the objectives that they want to achieve, or just the fact that it's, you know, day-to-day operations from a potential loss perspective. The way that I've seen people want to become more trusted. So let's take a CISO, for example. The CISO's contribution to being more trusted, and they have a lot of tools that face internally and insider threats, and externally from external threats. So what they have the ability to do is turn around and say, well, okay, my contribution to being more trusted is to provide you the outcomes of the measurements of actually how effective we are at being able to understand, prevent, detect, respond to the internal threats and the external threats. You can't stop them from happening, right? That is the reality. Everyone knows this. People will be breached, regardless of whether you do moat and castle, zero trust. The reality is just that. However, it's about being able to provide the evidence, and continuous evidence is this sort of continuous compliance piece that people are sort of talking about. So you can pick certain metrics that can contribute. So when you're reporting up, you could actually start to have a bit of a, you know, a trust barometer to a certain degree, where you go beyond just the traditional heat maps that unfortunately are pseudoscience to a certain degree. I mean, I'm not a fan of heat maps at the best of times. But what you can do is you can say, look, we have these core business objectives. We have these key risks that potentially could prevent you from achieving these objectives, whether they're medium or long term. I have these controls in place. These controls are effective or ineffective. These are the actions that we're taking. And this is what audit came along, because unfortunately for the average CISO, every day is audit. This is the actions that we need to take from there. And combined, what you'll be able to do is measure the effectiveness of the response to the inability to achieve the objectives. Context is that critical piece. So the average CISO doesn't do objective-centric risk management, because that's not what the industry has really sort of pushed. It's always been, you know, what are my crown jewels? What are the risks associated with the crown jewels? We need to make sure that the business, you know, to the holy tenets of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we do all the things that we need to do. We have our compliance, our standards and frameworks, blah, 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 blah. Whereas if we chuck in objective-centric, and we can then say, well, these are the risks that prevent the business objectives from being achieved, and this is my contribution to that, then we can start to actually measure parts of the trust profile. So that's one sort of simple example, relatively simple example. But there are other things that organizations can do. They can go beyond just training and education. So what a lot of people tend to do when it comes, and this is across the board, this isn't just, you know, information security. This tends to be quite standard, where you use a learning management solution of some description, you push out the training, you get them to take a test, and everyone's happy. Whereas actually, whilst that is necessary, it can be done. We can improve risk and compliance culture by ensuring that actually people's day-to-day jobs. So Joe or Josephine blogs in finance who do month-end close, they have aspects that they have to do. Now, that affects potential compliance, whether it's SOX compliance, UK SOX, or localized regulations or whatever has to be reported on. And they know that from a process perspective. However, if there's aspects of that process that can be changed or incorporated, that going forward, the build up to it incorporates the steps and actions and the myopic kind of view that people want to take on it at the end of that process, then it will make that roundup, when we come to true up at the end and we have to do the reporting on it, much more effective. And that's that kind of culturally piece. So it's embedding it into the fabric of the day-to-day, rather than just saying, because of our compliance at the end of the month, we have to report it in a certain way because that's what the CFO wants or we need. And they're the differences that people can take. As I said, there isn't like a 10-step point system to becoming more trusted. It's just about embedding risk and compliance pieces into the fabric and culture of the day of the organization.
All right, fantastic. This is kind of a vivid explanation based on practical tasks at hand. So we are unfortunately running out of time. Maybe last question I ask all my guests because we are running global risk community, and I also wanted to ask all my guests what is from our perspective, how can we improve and contribute to the better process of understanding of this complex world of risk management?
Oh, that's a good question. So you mean from like us as champions?
Like as a global risk community, as our own organization, how we can improve from your perspective, what we can do better to?
So this is going to be slightly controversial. A little bit of controversy at the end of a conversation is always good. I think that we have to recognize that the businesses have changed. The edge of the business or line of business, whatever you want to call it, depending on whether you believe in the 3 lines of defense or whatever. They have changed significantly. They are getting younger. There is levels of expectations that are different to, I think, the generations like myself. Like I'm an old man, so I can confidently and comfortably say this. We have to recognize the fact that the times are changing, and that when we implement tools and solutions, we don't just think of ourselves. We think of the outcome that we're expecting the end user to provide us with. And I think that's how we improve as a community. If we're going to use tooling, we don't just buy for us, we buy with the audience in mind. That's critical to success and embedding of risk-based culture within an organization.
All right, fantastic, Scott. Thank you for your time, and it was another great interview, and hope to speak to you maybe in a few months and another topic of interest in you think about maybe some specific topic of risk like cyber and other topics.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.